Ladies and gentlemen, everything begins with a story. Allow me to share mine. When 9/11 happened, I was a student at the University of Minnesota in the United States. That morning, before I even realized what was going on, my father calls me. He's like, Suleiman, if anybody asks you your name, tell them your name is Jose and you're from Mexico. It wasn't a long time until I learned that he was right. Shortly afterwards, I was attacked by 4 guys for no other reason other than being an Arab. Frustrated and angry, I decided I had to do something. I decided not to let racism win. And the best way to fight racism is to start with the young. See, I realized very quickly that one of the biggest problems for those attackers who attacked me, they had only one story about Arabs, and that was 9/11. So I started going to school children, ages 6 and 7, in the schools around the university. Started talking to them about Middle Eastern culture, spreading a message of tolerance, and basically spreading a message that we're not all terrorists. One day, a 6-year-old girl stood up from the crowd. She's like, Suleiman, I have a question. I'm like, what's your question? And she's like, is there an Arabic Barbie? And the boys go crazy. Is there an Arab Superman? Is there an Arab Batman? And at the time, of course, there wasn't. And I couldn't get the idea out of my head. One thing led to another. Started teaching myself how to draw. Started creating characters for the first time in my life. One second. What started out as a question from a 6-year-old girl ended up being a sketch on a piece of paper. And by working with a team of creative artists from around the world, ended up being this. What was really funny is when I was 10 years old, my parents hired a private tutor to try and teach me some art and some music, get my creative juices flowing. After 1 week, she quit on me, gave me back all the money, and told me I don't have a creative bone in my body. I would pay that money 100-fold just to see her watch this. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the stories. This, for example, is one of the stories where the girls just drove me crazy in Jordan. They wanted a story for them. They wanted something that represented them. So what I did is I went back to one of the most famous mythologies in the Middle East, which is the 1001 Nights, and decided to create a twist on it. And I actually developed this with the kids in focus groups. This is, however, it hasn't been all so smooth and easy. This is the story of Salah ad-Din 2100. It's one of the very first sci-fi graphic novels. It was actually co-written with a British writer, Mr. Tony Lee, the writer of Doctor Who comic books. Unfortunately, it was turned down by the government because the story took place 100 years in the future, and it was deemed, quote, unquote, dangerous to our values and our traditions. This is another story that really pissed off a lot of the people in the education ministry specifically. This is the story of Section 9. This is based on a real-life story. This is the story of the first counter-terrorism unit, all female, active currently in the field. This is a Jordanian unit that exists in real life today. Sadly, again, they didn't like the fact that we have female heroine models. The good news, though, is in 2010, 2011, we ended up selling and publishing 1.2 million comic books. One of the good things about this is I work in a lot of focus groups. So this is one of the focus groups. I go to low-income areas quite a bit as well, and I do focus groups there. In one of the focus groups, I asked the kids, so who are your heroes? And the kids just looked at me and were like, well, we don't really have heroes. But I'm like, okay, well, who do you hear about a lot in the news, what, et cetera? And they're like, well, we hear a lot about Bin Laden, we hear a lot about Zarqawi. I'm like, okay, well, what do you hear? And they're like, well, that they defend us against America, against the West. The West is coming here to kill us, and they're defending us. And of course, this is a one-on-one terrorist propaganda, so I didn't want to argue with it. So what I did is I started giving them comic books for free. After a period of several months, I came back asking the exact same question. Not a single kid mentions Bin Laden. They're all talking about the comic book characters. And that led me to understand that there's a huge appetite and need for positive, heroic role models and positive narratives and so on. So why narratives? Why even study narratives? I decided as a result to start my journey into studying extremist narratives and their mythology. So why would I do that? Because if I want to understand their violence and what they're preaching, if I understand it, I can prevent it. And before I go on, I just want to make one thing clear. Studying violence is not excusing. Studying extremism is not excusing it. So what is so powerful about narratives and myths? Well, narratives and myths give us a compelling sense of purpose. They give us a sense of direction in our life. They tell us where we want to go, what kind of actions that we need to take. And this is not just on an individual level. on a group level or even a collective level, like a group like ISIS, a group like Al-Qaeda, and so on, it's incredibly important because it tells us a lot about the group members, where they come from, where they have been, what their tactics are, where they want to go, what are their objectives, goals, etc. Let me tell you just a quick overview of some of the narratives that are very major in the Middle East. One, that the West is at war with Islam. The idea behind this narrative is the West is deliberately humiliating Muslims all over the world, Muslim countries, stealing their properties, stealing their, what's the word in English? Their resources. The infidel narrative, which is the infidel invaders. This is the narrative that's really old from the Crusader era. And basically the idea is the Crusaders are coming, again, to steal our resources, create havoc and destruction in the Middle East. Last but not least is the hypocrites narrative. And that narrative is usually used for other Muslims, for Muslims who don't agree with them. Anyone who doesn't agree with ISIS or Al-Qaeda is labeled as a hypocrite. And what's interesting about the last two narratives, the infidel and the hypocrites, those are the two main narratives that extremist groups use to justify killing of innocent people and people who don't agree with them. And if you look at them, it's a dehumanization narrative. It's a shaming narrative. Once you label somebody as a hypocrite, label them as an infidel, then in that mythology, you just justified killing them. They're no longer human. Another really important one is the heroic journey. This is a common theme across all extremist mythologies. And basically, the ultimate heroic journey in Islam is the journey of the Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet Muhammad was a regular man, and then he was going to the middle of the desert. He goes to the cave, he starts meditating. The archangel Gabriel comes down, he comes out of the desert with a message and unites fighting Arabic tribes around the compelling vision of Islam. Similarly, bin Laden tried to copy that journey. Bin Laden was an aristocratic, spoiled brat in Saudi Arabia. He went to the caves in Afghanistan. He had that cleansing ritual, and he stayed there meditating for a long time. Then came back up with the whole concept behind Al-Qaeda, uniting Islam, and more importantly, one of the biggest themes behind this journey for him is the cleansing of the shame and humiliation of the Islamic nation through violence. This is what Joseph Campbell refers to as the hero with 1,000 faces. He's a mythologist who studied mythologies around the world and basically came up with the conclusion that all mythologies at the end of the day are one, and that is the heroic journey. And they all share certain steps. So, as I started publishing comic books, after I started publishing approximately 300,000 copies, extremists in Jordan became aware of my efforts. They attacked me outside of my office with a razor blade. And that's how you see the scar on my face. At the time, I used to drive a motorcycle. So I had to cauterize my own wound with a piece of steel, a heated piece of steel, in order to close it so I can get medical help. If you don't like, I just got to give you a warning. This is a graphic image. But good things came out of this. One, my dating life improved exponentially. Except in Jordan, by the way. Two, more importantly, I learned something. These guys, when they attacked me, in my country, my language, we call that ta'lime. That means to mark somebody, to mark them with shame. Think of it as a mark of Cain, even. It was a process of shaming me, transferring the shame from them to me, replacing their own shame with pride. So that got me thinking. I'm like, hold on a second. There's got to be something going on here. Let me dig into this whole shame thing. Let's see what's going on with shame. So I decided to start researching shame and see if there's any links between shame and extremism. So what's shame, really quick? Shame is a very core, basic human emotion. It's the feeling that I am not worthy, I'm not good looking enough, I'm not thin enough, etc., etc. And it's very different from guilt. Guilt is I am not good enough. Guilt is about doing something. Shame is about being something. And there's two types of shame. There's healthy shame and there's toxic shame. Healthy shame is the source of learning. It lets you know your boundaries. It's the source of human connectivity. We are hardwired for connection. So it's incredibly important. Toxic shame is the core belief that I am flawed as a human being. Therefore, I am not worthy of a human connection. Now, when this happens, one's own life becomes so painful that they start developing defenses. One of those defenses is violence, because violence is an attempt to replace that shame with pride. Healthy shame can turn into toxic shame as well. And the way that happens is when you internalize the feeling. For example, I'm sure all of us know someone who's always angry. They're not feeling angry, they're just always angry. They internalized that anger. That anger became their identity. That is what toxic shame is all about. How does this relate to extremism? It's quite interesting. One, all addiction is rooted in shame, in toxic shame to be more specific. But even more staggering, all violence is rooted in shame, in one way, in one form or another. James Gilligan, a famous psychiatrist who went and studied prisoners and murderers across the world for more than 30 years, came down with eventually a new theory for violence. All violence is rooted in toxic shame. And the purpose of the violence, again, like those attackers who attacked me, is to replace their violence with pride. Replace their toxic shame with pride. Violence towards others, such as homicide, is the purpose to diminish shame and replace it with its opposite. Now, what's really interesting here is when you are overwhelmed with shame, your instinct of self-preservation no longer holds, which would definitely help explain the suicide bomber phenomena. Hold on a second. So how does this relate back to ISIS? Well, here's the thing. ISIS focuses so predominantly, and a lot of these extremist groups, on violence. I mean, it comes down to the scale, it's almost the scale of genocide in some places. It can be considered a pure culture of violence. As such, shame is so important to their central motive. Let me give you a quick example. Bin Laden, for example, in all his letters and interviews, etc., he always talks about how the Ummah, which is the Muslim nation, has been humiliated, it's been shamed, and violence is the only way to cleanse it. Similarly with ISIS, and interestingly enough, this is the similar approach that the Nazis used. Hitler came to power on the promise to undo, quote unquote, the shame of Versailles, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But that promise is very, very strong in the fact that it taps into the collective culture and the collective sentiment. So, ladies and gentlemen, the biggest problem we face in the Middle East is not just ISIS. The biggest problem we face is terrorism disguised as heroism. This is a big problem for us. But make no mistake, heroism based on toxic shame, on murder, and dehumanizing of other people is nothing but false heroism. We must develop a counter mythology we must develop a counter mythology based on healthy shame, based on personal agency, based on positive narratives of resilience, of hope, and more importantly, of male and female heroines. And the best way to accomplish that is this right here, is this medium, comic books. This is the best weapon we have. What's really interesting about this as well is the latest research shows that one of the key factors towards a person taking a positive heroic action when a situation demands it is heroic imagination. This is the best technology we have to cultivate heroic imagination in the youth. David beat Goliath with a slingshot. Similarly, ladies and gentlemen, we can beat ISIS with this. This is our weapon, but this weapon does not kill. This is a weapon of hope, this is a weapon of inspiration, a weapon of love, a weapon of heroes. Thank you very much.